Dyslexia is a brain-based condition that affects reading, writing, and spelling. Dyslexia is a lifelong condition that tends to run in families. A parent, cousin, or grandparent may have dyslexia, or they may have struggled in school without a formal diagnosis. Dyslexia has nothing to do with a child's intelligence. In fact, researchers are starting to study the strengths that may be associated with dyslexia. The research also shows that dyslexia is not a problem with vision, but rather a problem with understanding aspects of our language and connecting the sounds in our language to the letters that represent them. Scientists know this because they are able to study the brain and see what happens when people are doing language tasks. What they see in people with dyslexia is that they use different, less effective pathways in their brain for certain language tasks. This is why children who are at risk for dyslexia can be identified as early as preschool, before children learn to read. These are the kids who may struggle with rhyming, with blending sounds, and pulling them apart. These are activities that can be done orally, but our kids still tend to struggle with them. For example, when we hear the word cat, we know that there are 3 sounds in that word. K, a, t. It seems obvious to us, but that's only because our brain has learned to isolate the smallest unit of sound in our language. For someone with dyslexia, their brain isn't wired that way. They may hear the word cat, but they may not be able to isolate the 3 sounds that make up that word. It's similar to the experience you might have if you're studying a foreign language and you listen to someone who is speaking fluently in that language. They go so fast, and everything they say is strung together. It's really hard to try and figure out what they're saying. You may know individual words and a few phrases, but it's really hard to isolate the ones that you know when you're listening to fluent speech. The same is true with our language. When we first begin to speak, we're only aware of spoken language. We know nothing about written language. For example, your parents might come into your room and say, "Do you want something to eat?" What you hear is one long phrase that might be represented with letters like this. It's only when we start to study written language that we realize that sentences are made up of words, and those words are made up of individual sounds that we have attached onto letters that can actually be pulled apart. For children with dyslexia, this can be extremely challenging. They struggle to hear all the individual sounds in a word, and they struggle to attach those sounds onto letters. And these are the skills that are critical to become a good reader and speller. Luckily, scientists have a much better understanding now of why our kids are struggling. It starts with realizing that reading is actually a relatively new process for humans. We've only been doing it for about 5,000 years. Unlike speech, our brains were not automatically wired to be able to read. We may take it for granted, but reading is actually a very complex process. And in order for us to accomplish it, our brain had to rearrange itself and use different areas in the brain that were intended for other things. For people with dyslexia, they tend to struggle with this process, and they have to be explicitly taught in a specific manner in order for that change to occur in their brain, in order for them to build new, effective pathways for reading and spelling. Luckily, the research also shows us that specialized instruction that is explicit and focuses on helping children break words down into their individual sounds, attach those sounds onto letters, and blend them together to make words, helps make some of those connections in the brain. The most common approach to do this is the Orton-Gillingham approach. The Orton-Gillingham approach teaches children the structure of the language and provides them the opportunity to practice and get more fluent. You can actually see the difference in the brain of a person who has had effective structured literacy intervention. So while dyslexia is a lifelong condition, with the right interventions and support, a person with dyslexia can become a skilled reader. Dyslexia in no way limits a child's potential or possibilities.